It was one of those bitterly cold mornings, the kind that makes you pull your coat tighter and hurry past anyone who might slow you down. The city was alive with its usual chaos: honking horns, hurried footsteps, and the occasional chatter of street vendors setting up shop. Beneath the towering buildings and flashing billboards, though, there was another world. One we all see, but rarely stop to notice. On the corner near the coffee shop, a cluster of homeless people huddled together for warmth. They sat on worn blankets, their faces marked by the harshness of life on the streets. Some were asleep, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing. Others stared blankly ahead, their expressions a mix of weariness and resignation. I couldn't help but think about how easily most of us judge them. We glance at their ragged clothes, their unshaven faces, and their tattered belongings, and we assume we know their stories. We label them as failures, addicts, or burdens to society, forgetting they're people just like us. Each of them has a past, a reason they ended up here. But in the rush of daily life, it's easier to look away, to pretend they're invisible. Today, though, that was about to change. Frank sat on the cold concrete, his back pressed against the brick wall of an old storefront. His hands rested on his lap, fingers stiff from the winter chill. Beside him lay a tattered duffel bag, its seams barely holding together. It was all he had left, his life reduced to a handful of worn-out possessions. He wasn't bothering anyone, just sitting quietly, watching the endless parade of feet and faces rushing past. Most people didn't even glance his way. Those who did offered only looks of disdain or pity. Then came the sharp clatter of boots on pavement. 2 police officers approached, their faces stern. "Hey, you can't sit here," one of them barked, towering over Frank. Frank looked up slowly, his calm eyes meeting their harsh glares. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer," he said softly. "Trouble or not, you're loitering," the other officer shot back. "Got any ID? What are you doing here?" Their tone wasn't just firm, it was accusatory, as if Frank's mere presence was a crime. People started to glance over, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Frank sighed, his shoulders slumping, and reached for his bag. The officers didn't know it yet, but this quiet man's story would soon leave them speechless. Frank didn't flinch under the officer's sharp words. Instead, he nodded slightly, his voice steady but soft. "I don't have ID, sir," he said, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees. "I'm just trying to stay warm. I'll move if you need me to." There was no defensiveness, no anger, just a quiet acceptance of their authority. It was as though he'd had this conversation too many times to count, and knew better than to resist. The officers exchanged a glance, one of them muttering something under his breath. "Look, you can't just hang out here. People are complaining." "I understand," Frank said simply, starting to gather his things. His movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as he folded a thin blanket and carefully placed it into his duffel bag. I watched from across the street, struck by his composure. There was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, even as he was being treated like a nuisance. He didn't argue or raise his voice, even though it was clear the situation was unfair. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just humility, it was strength. Frank had nothing left, yet he refused to let anger or bitterness define him. It was heartbreaking and admirable all at once. As Frank picked up his duffel bag, one of the officers paused, his eyes narrowing at a small metallic glint. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. Frank hesitated. The officer reached down, pulling at the edge of the badge stitched onto the worn fabric. It was a military insignia, faded but unmistakable. "You serve?" the officer asked, his tone less sharp now, curiosity creeping in. Frank straightened slightly, his hands tightening around the strap of his bag. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "United States Marine Corps, served in Iraq and Afghanistan." The officers exchanged a surprised look. "What's this doing here?" one of them asked, gesturing to the badge. Frank let out a heavy breath, the weight of his past suddenly pressing on his shoulders. "I came home with more scars than I left with," he began, his voice low. "The ones you can't see, PTSD. Lost my job, then my family." He swallowed hard, his words catching in his throat. "And now, this is all I've got left." The officer's expression softened as Frank spoke, his voice cracking with raw emotion. But Frank didn't cry. He looked at them with the same quiet dignity, holding back tears with every ounce of strength he had. The officers stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of Frank's words hanging heavy in the air. The hardened expressions they'd worn earlier had softened into something else, regret, maybe even shame. One of them, the younger of the two, cleared his throat. I'm sorry, he said, his voice quieter now. We shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. Frank looked up at him, surprised by the change in tone. The officer shifted awkwardly, running a hand over the back of his neck. It's just, we deal with a lot of stuff out here, you know? But that doesn't excuse how we treated you. I'm sorry, man. The older officer nodded in agreement, his eyes fixed on the badge attached to Frank's bag. Is there anything we can do for you? He asked, his voice sincere. Frank hesitated, caught off guard by their sudden kindness. I don't need much, he said softly. Just a place to stay out of the cold for a while. Maybe some help getting back on my feet. The officers exchanged a look. We'll figure something out, the older one said firmly. You deserve better than this. For the first time that morning, Frank's tired face lit up with a glimmer of hope. As the officers spoke to Frank, I felt a pull deep in my chest. I couldn't just stand there anymore. Stepping forward, I introduced myself. Frank, I said gently, you shouldn't be going through this alone. Let me help. He looked at me, surprised, his weathered face softening. Thank you, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the shift in tone. Whispers spread as people realized what was happening. A homeless man, harassed for simply existing, turned out to be a decorated war hero. One passerby, a young woman with a smartphone, began filming. This is the kind of story people need to see, she said, her voice shaking with passion. She posted it online with a caption that read, From the streets to the battlefield, meet Frank, the Marine we all forgot but must remember. Within hours, the post went viral. Calls started pouring in, from veterans organizations, local shelters, even ordinary citizens wanting to help. By evening, Frank had been offered a warm bed in a veterans housing program, along with counseling and support services. The crowd began to disperse, but I stayed, watching Frank as he thanked everyone with tears in his eyes. Hope was finally within reach. A month later, I found myself standing outside a modest building on the edge of town. It was a transitional housing center for veterans, and I was here to see Frank. When he opened the door, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who once sat hunched on the cold sidewalk now stood taller, his face brighter, and his eyes alive with something I hadn't seen before. Hope. Come in, he said warmly, leading me into a small but cozy room. On the table was a photo of a young woman and a little boy. That's my daughter Lily and her son, Frank said, his voice soft. She found me after seeing the video online. We're talking again. She even brought my grandson to visit last weekend. He paused, a tear slipping down his cheek. I thought I'd lost them forever. He told me about the therapy sessions he'd been attending, how they were helping him cope with the nightmares and the weight he'd carried for years. I don't know where I'd be if that day hadn't happened, Frank said, his voice filled with gratitude. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I've got a future to look forward to. As I walked away from Frank's room, I couldn't help but think about how much had changed in such a short time. A month ago, he was just another face on the street to most people. A man ignored, judged, and dismissed without a second thought. But Frank wasn't just homeless. He was a Marine, a father, a hero who had given so much and suffered even more. How many times had I walked past someone like him without stopping, without wondering about their story? It's easy to make snap judgments, to assume we know who someone is based on what we see. But the truth is, we rarely know the battles someone is fighting. Frank taught me something profound that day. Everyone deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with dignity. It costs us nothing to show compassion, yet it can change someone's entire world. If there's one thing I hope people take away from Frank's story, it's this. Look closer. Ask questions. Extend kindness. Because beneath the surface of every person, no matter how broken or forgotten they seem, there's a story worth knowing. And sometimes, that story has the power to remind us of our shared humanity. Thank you so much for watching Frank's powerful story. It's a reminder that everyone has a past, a journey, and a story that deserves to be heard. If this touched your heart or made you think differently, let's keep the conversation going. Please take a moment to like this video if it resonated with you. Comment below with your thoughts or share a story of compassion and understanding that you've experienced. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more stories like this. Stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power of kindness. And most importantly, share this video with your friends, family, or anyone who needs to be reminded of the impact a little humanity can have. Together, we can spread these important messages far and wide. Your support means everything to us. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next story.